April 8, 1968, London Heathrow, BOAC Flight 712. A Boeing 707 carrying 127 people. 4 minutes after takeoff, the number 2 engine exploded and fell off the left wing. The aircraft landed safely. The pilots saved the airplane, but the fire that should have gone out never did. Because one handle in the cockpit, the handle that would have shut off the fuel, was never pulled. 5 people reached for it. None of them pulled it. 90 seconds after touchdown, the cabin was an inferno. 122 people survived. 5 did not. The last person seen alive inside the aircraft was a 22-year-old flight attendant who had already reached the exit, already stood in the doorway with the fire behind her, and turned back in. How does a survivable engine failure kill 5 people? And what made a young woman walk back into a burning airplane when she had every chance to save herself? The answer to both questions begins with the same small detail, a handle that nobody pulled. The afternoon was bright and calm. A light westerly breeze crossed the runways. April haze gave the sunlight a golden tint. Flight 712 was scheduled to depart Heathrow at 4:15 for Zurich, the first leg of a marathon service that would continue through Tel Aviv, Tehran, Mumbai, Singapore, and finally Sydney. 6 segments, 10,000 miles. Nearly 2 days of flying. In 1968, that was what it took to reach the other side of the world in a jet. The aircraft was a Boeing 707-465, registration Golf Alpha Romeo Whiskey Echo, 6 years old, powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Conway turbofan engines. It had logged roughly 21,000 flight hours and 7,500 pressurization cycles, middle-aged by 707 standards. It had also been involved in a previous engine fire after landing in Honolulu the year before. That event was unrelated to what was about to happen, but it hung over this aircraft like a shadow. The captain was 47 years old, one of BOAC's most capable pilots. Nearly 15,000 hours total, though only 1,555 on the 707. He was being observed on this flight by a check captain seated in the jump seat, a routine proficiency evaluation. To his right sat the first officer, 32, with 5,500 hours. Behind them, the flight engineer, 35, managed the fuel, hydraulics, and electrics, a critical role on an aircraft with no automated systems monitoring. His total time was 6,400 hours, but only 190 on the 707. A second officer also occupied the cockpit, though his role would be minimal. In the cabin, 6 flight attendants prepared for the long journey ahead. Among them was Barbara Jane Harrison, 22 years old, in her second year with the airline, known by her colleagues for a calm temperament and a quick smile. She was stationed at the rear of the aircraft, assigned to the aft doors. Her job in an emergency was to open the rear exit, deploy the escape chute, and guide passengers out. Harrison had joined BOAC after working as a nanny in the United States and Switzerland. She grew up in Bradford, the daughter of a police officer. Her mother had died when she was 10. By 22, she had already lived in 3 countries and held 3 different jobs before settling into the airline. Her colleagues remembered her as someone who took the work seriously without taking herself too seriously. The kind of person who would rehearse emergency procedures without complaint and then crack a joke in the galley afterward. At the rear of the cabin, she and her colleagues stowed the service carts and checked the emergency equipment. Further forward, passengers settled into their seats. Some were reading newspapers. A mother adjusted a blanket over her young daughter. A woman in a wheelchair was helped into position in the last row by ground staff, her mobility aid stowed in the hold below. The cabin door closed with a heavy click. The jet bridge pulled away. Outside, the April light caught the polished aluminum of the 707's fuselage, and ground crews cleared the area as the 4 Conways began to turn. The passengers boarded through mobile stairs, families, business travelers, a few clergy bound for Switzerland. For many of them, this would have been among their first flights in a jet aircraft. The cabin doors closed. The 707 taxied to runway 28 left. The flight engineer confirmed that all 4 engine anti-ice valves were closed. The temperature was well above freezing. The pre-takeoff checklist was completed. The check captain noted the captain's crisp command flow on his paperwork. Everything was going well. At 4:27 in the afternoon, the captain released the brakes and advanced the thrust levers. The 4 Conways spooled up, and the 707 accelerated down the runway. The first officer called V1, then rotate. The captain pulled back on the yoke, and the aircraft lifted into the London sky. The landing gear retracted. In the cabin, the flight attendants began securing the galley carts. To understand what happened next, you need to know what sits inside a jet engine. The low-pressure compressor is a series of spinning discs, each carrying a ring of blades that draw air in and compress it before feeding it into the combustion chamber. Each disc spins at thousands of revolutions per minute under immense heat and stress. Over time, microscopic cracks can form in the metal, usually caught by regular inspection. But in 1968, the science of fatigue analysis was still in its infancy. Engineers were only beginning to understand how complex vibration patterns could slowly destroy metal from within. In a modern engine, the casing around the compressor and turbine sections is designed to absorb the energy of a disk burst. Layers of high-strength alloy and composite material built specifically to catch fragments and keep them from escaping. This is called containment, and every engine certified for commercial aviation today must demonstrate that it can survive a disk failure without releasing high-energy debris into the airframe. But in the 1960s, that standard did not exist in the form it does now. The Rolls-Royce Conway engines fitted to this 707 had containment rings designed to handle blade releases, individual blades breaking free from a disc, but not the catastrophic disintegration of an entire disc stage. The distinction matters enormously. A single blade is a small piece of metal that can be caught by the casing. A full disc failure releases fragments weighing several kilograms each, spinning at the speed of a rifle bullet, carrying enough kinetic energy to slice through steel, aluminum, fuel lines, hydraulic lines, and the wing structure itself. When the fifth stage disc of the No. 2 engine came apart, it did exactly that. Deep inside the No. 2 engine, the fifth stage low-pressure compressor disc had been carrying a hidden crack for months. With each cycle of thrust and vibration, it had grown a fraction of a millimeter wider. As the 707 climbed through 3,000 feet, 20 seconds after takeoff, the disc reached its limit. It shattered. The fragments, spinning at thousands of RPM, burst through the engine casing like shrapnel. In a contained failure, those pieces would stay trapped inside the heavy steel housing. That is what the engine's certification required. But the containment ring on these early Rolls-Royce engines was not strong enough. The failure was uncontained. Chunks of compressor disc tore through the casing, severed the oil and fuel lines, blasted parts of the cowling clear off, and continued into the slipstream. What had been a functioning engine was now a mangled shell venting fuel and fire. The ruptured fuel feed line sprayed jet fuel directly into the hot core of the engine. It ignited instantly. Flames erupted from the rear of the nacelle, climbed up the pylon, and began feeding on the paint and aluminum skin of the wing's underside. The fire burned with the intensity of a blowtorch, fed by dozens of liters of fuel per minute still being pumped through the open line. In the cockpit, the pilots heard the bang and felt the aircraft yaw left. The No. 2 engine instruments showed declining values. The captain reacted immediately. He closed the No. 2 thrust lever and called for the engine failure drill. But when the thrust lever came back to idle, with the landing gear already retracted, it triggered the landing gear warning horn, a loud, continuous tone filling the cockpit. The captain, first officer, and check captain all reached forward at once to silence it. The captain hit the correct cancel switch, but the first officer, reaching past it in the confusion, pressed the button next to it, the fire bell cancel button. So when the engine fire detection system activated moments later and tried to sound its alarm, the bell never rang. The only indication of fire became the illuminated red light beside the No. 2 fire handle on the flight engineer's panel. The fire handle. If pulled, it would close the fuel shutoff valve, close the hydraulic shutoff valve, and arm the fire extinguisher bottles. It was the single most critical action for an engine fire. The flight engineer reached for it, his hand was on it, and then he hesitated and withdrew. He was still working through the engine failure drill. The engine failure drill did not call for pulling the fire handle. The fire drill did. But the two procedures were nearly identical in their early steps, and under stress, the boundary between them blurred. He had not heard the fire bell, because it had been silenced before it could ring. He saw the illuminated handle, but a moment of doubt was enough. He moved on. If you're watching this and wondering how that's possible, take a second to subscribe. It's stories like this that changed how every cockpit in the world operates today. A few seconds later, the check captain looked out his side window and saw the wing engulfed in flames. He shouted it out. The captain immediately ordered the engine fire procedure. The flight engineer switched to the fire checklist, which was divided into Phase 1 memory items and Phase 2 read and do items from a printed card. He believed he had already completed Phase 1 from memory during the engine failure drill, so he opened the card and began Phase 2. But Phase 1 of the fire drill contained one additional step that the engine failure drill did not: pull the fire handle. That step had never been completed, and the flight engineer, who had thought about pulling it moments earlier and stopped himself, now carried a false memory of having done it. He never looked down to verify. The fuel shutoff valve remained open. The fuel pump continued feeding the ruptured line at full pressure. The automatic fire extinguisher discharged into the nacelle and was immediately overwhelmed by the constant stream of fuel. It accomplished nothing. At this point, every person in the cockpit believed the fire was being fought. The fire extinguisher had discharged. The engine instruments were reading 0. The checklist had been completed, or so the flight engineer thought. From their perspective, they had done everything the procedure required. But in reality, the single most important step had been skipped. The fire handle sat in its normal position, unpulled. The fuel shutoff valve was open. Hydraulic fluid was pouring through the severed lines, and the extinguisher gas that had been pumped into the nacelle had dissipated in seconds, overwhelmed by the continuous spray of fuel. The fire was not being fought, it was being fed. This was not a failure of competence, it was a failure of design. BOAC's emergency procedures at the time maintained two separate checklists, one for engine failure and one for engine fire. The two procedures shared almost identical opening steps. The critical difference, pulling the fire handle, appeared only in the fire drill. Under the stress of an actual emergency, with multiple crew members working through procedures simultaneously, with a gear warning horn blaring and a fire bell that never sounded, the boundary between the two checklists collapsed. The flight engineer completed the wrong procedure and moved on to Phase 2 of the right one, carrying a false memory of having pulled a handle that his hand had only touched. No one in the cockpit caught the error. Not the captain, who was focused on flying the aircraft. Not the first officer, who was communicating with ATC. Not the check captain, who had just seen the wing on fire and was processing the severity of what they were facing. And not the second officer, who was positioned too far back to see the panel clearly. 5 trained professionals, and the single most important switch in the cockpit sat untouched for the entire flight. From the ground, witnesses saw a trail of orange flame stretching behind the left wing as the 707 streaked overhead. In the cockpit, the captain turned back toward Heathrow, hand-flying the aircraft with asymmetric thrust and constant right input to counter the drag from the burning wing. The first officer transmitted the mayday. Air traffic control activated the crash alarm and cleared all traffic. 2.5 minutes after the failure, the extreme heat weakened the engine pylon beyond its load limit. With a sharp metallic crack, the number 2 engine separated from the wing and fell 3,000 feet into a flooded gravel pit near Thorpe, narrowly missing a group of children playing nearby. On the ground below, residents of the village of Thorpe heard the 707 before they saw it. A deep, uneven roar that was nothing like the steady hum of normal traffic out of Heathrow. When they looked up, they saw a wide trail of orange flame stretching behind the left wing of a large airliner, the fire bright enough to be visible against the afternoon sky. The engine, now separated from the aircraft, tumbled through the air for several seconds before crashing into a flooded gravel pit at the edge of the village. The impact sent a column of water and mud skyward. Children who had been playing on the bank of the pit ran screaming. Miraculously, none of them were hit. The engine embedded itself in the soft ground, still trailing smoke. Nearby, a farmer, working his field, later told reporters that the sound of the impact was like a bomb going off. He did not know what had fallen until he walked over and saw the twisted metal half submerged in the water, still hot to the touch. Meanwhile, 3,000 feet above, the 707 continued toward Heathrow with a hole in its left wing where the engine had been, and fuel still pouring from the open line into the fire. The captain felt a slight change in handling, but did not realize the engine had departed. The fire continued. now fed by an open fuel line pumping hundreds of liters of jet fuel into the void where the engine had been. The crew decided they could not make it back to runway 28 left. It was too far. Instead, they chose runway 05 right, shorter, with no instrument landing system, but much closer. The captain executed a 270-degree descending left turn, hand-flying the burning aircraft the entire way. He extended the flaps gradually. They stopped at 47 degrees when the hydraulic lines on the left side burned through. 47 degrees would have to do. He crossed the threshold at 160 knots, flared, and touched down firmly on the center line 800 feet into the runway. Reverse thrust on engines 1 and 4. Full brakes. The 707 decelerated and came to a stop. The landing was a masterpiece, but the fire was already winning. The moment the aircraft stopped, the evacuation began. The forward right door opened, and the slide deployed normally. This became the primary exit. 80 passengers were out within 40 seconds. The forward left slide deployed, but immediately melted under the heat from the burning wing and caught fire. Unusable. The right overwing exits were opened by passengers who climbed out and jumped 2 meters to the tarmac. At the rear, the steward opened the right door and the slide deployed, but twisted and failed to inflate properly. He jumped down, tried to hold it straight, and called for passengers to follow. That left the rear of the cabin in the hands of Barbara Jane Harrison. The rear left door was unusable. The outer skin was glowing, the handle too hot to touch. Harrison abandoned it and positioned herself at the remaining rear right exit. She steadied the partially inflated slide and guided passengers through the door. 5 made it down before the heat collapsed the slide entirely. Harrison continued, pushing people to jump when they froze in the doorway. A mother with 2 children hesitated. Harrison took 1 child under each arm, helped them both down, then turned back inside. The smoke layer descended below head height. Passengers in the last rows could barely see the aisle lights. Harrison ran back to them, shouting for them to move forward. Some crawled under the smoke. Others followed the sound of her voice. Each time she brought a group to the exit, she turned back in for more. Her uniform darkened with soot. Flames flashed through the windows behind her. She beat at the burning slide fabric with her bare hands to keep it clear long enough for 2 more passengers to escape. A crew member outside signaled for her to come out. She didn't respond. She was still inside. There was a woman in a wheelchair who could not move on her own. A mother and daughter frozen with fear in the last row. 2 passengers fumbling with their seatbelts in the haze. Harrison paused in the doorway. She looked back into the cabin. Black smoke, orange flicker, the sound of hydraulic lines bursting inside the wing. The shouts from outside were faint. She turned back in. Witnesses saw her silhouette appear once more in the doorway, framed by the light of the fire. Then she disappeared into the smoke. Seconds later, a flashover swept through the rear galley, floor to ceiling. Barbara Jane Harrison and the 5 people she had gone back to save were killed. Less than 90 seconds had passed since the aircraft came to a stop. 122 of 127 people survived. The 5 who did not were all in the last rows of the cabin. The woman in the wheelchair, the mother and her daughter, 2 other passengers, and the 22-year-old flight attendant who refused to leave them behind. The investigation found that the disc failure itself was survivable. The 707 could fly on 3 engines. What made the fire uncontrollable was the fuel shutoff valve that was never closed, because the fire handle was never pulled. 5 people in the cockpit had the opportunity. The flight engineer reached for it and withdrew. The captain never pulled it after landing. The check captain, the first officer, the second officer, none of them caught the omission. The fire bell that would have alerted them had been silenced by accident before it could sound. And the 2 emergency checklists, engine failure and engine fire, were so similar that under stress, one was confused for the other. Airport firefighting also failed. The foam tenders that responded could not pump and move at the same time. They positioned behind the tail, putting the main fire just out of range. When a fuel explosion ripped across the tarmac, the crews ran for cover. The investigation concluded that the firefighting equipment at Heathrow, purchased in 1957, was inadequate even for the aircraft already in service, let alone for the Boeing 747 that was about to enter the fleet. The investigation's firefighting operations group was particularly damning in its assessment. The foam tenders that responded to the crash were 11 years old, purchased the year before the 707 entered service. They could deliver foam only while stationary, which meant that every time they needed to reposition, the fire went unfought. Their roof-mounted cannons could not reach the wing of a 707 from behind the tail, which was where they initially positioned themselves. And when the fuel explosion scattered burning debris across the tarmac, the crews had no choice but to retreat. For several critical seconds during the evacuation, no foam was being applied to the fire at all. The report noted that the Boeing 747, which was scheduled to enter service within 2 years, would carry 4 times the fuel of a 707 in a fuselage nearly twice as long. If Heathrow's fire equipment could not handle a 707, the consequences of a similar accident with a 747 were almost unthinkable. This finding led to an industry-wide overhaul of airport firefighting standards. New tenders were required to pump while moving. Foam delivery systems were upgraded for greater range and volume, and minimum response times were tightened, with fire crews required to reach any point on the runway within 3 minutes of an alert. The changes that followed reshaped the industry. BOAC merged the engine failure and engine fire checklists into a single procedure, the engine fire or severe failure drill, eliminating the confusion that had allowed the critical step to be skipped. A verification step was added, requiring the flight engineer to confirm the fire handle had been pulled before proceeding. Warning panels were redesigned across the industry so that the fire bell cancel and gear horn cancel could not be confused. Memory items were required to be re-verified by reading through the checklist after completion, a practice now standard in every airline in the world. And airports were required to upgrade their firefighting vehicles to pump foam while moving and deliver it at far greater range and volume. For the crew, the captain received the British Airline Pilots Association Gold Medal for his airmanship in landing the burning aircraft. The chief steward was awarded the British Empire Medal for gallantry. The air traffic controller, who managed the emergency, was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire. And Barbara Jane Harrison was awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian honor for bravery. She is the youngest woman ever to receive it, and the only woman to receive it outside of wartime. The citation describes her actions in the final seconds, how she helped passengers escape, turned back into the smoke when she could have saved herself, and gave her life trying to reach those who could not move on their own. Her medal was accepted by her father, Alan, a police officer from Bradford. She had lost her mother at 10 years old. She was 22 when she died. In the years after the accident, Harrison's story became part of the training curriculum for cabin crew across the British aviation industry. Her photograph was displayed in the BOAC Training Center, and later in British Airways facilities after the two airlines merged. New recruits learned her name not as a cautionary tale, but as the standard against which the profession measured itself. She had done exactly what she was trained to do: open the door, deploy the chute, guide passengers out. And then she had done what no training manual could require. She had gone back, not once, but repeatedly, into smoke so thick she could barely see, into heat so intense it melted the slide fabric beside her. For passengers she had never met, whose names she did not know, who could not save themselves. The George Cross citation uses the phrase, "gallantry of the highest order." The passengers who survived because of her used a different word. They called it love. A memorial plaque in her honor was placed at Heathrow Airport. It has since been moved several times as the terminal has been renovated, but her name remains in the records of the George Cross, fourth on a list that includes 3 women who served as secret agents behind enemy lines during World War II. Barbara Jane Harrison is the only one who earned it in peacetime, the only one who earned it in a doorway. In the weeks that followed, several of the surviving passengers wrote letters to BOAC, not complaints, not demands for compensation, but letters asking for the name of the young woman at the rear door. They remembered fragments, a calm voice cutting through the roar of the fire, hands gripping their arms, pushing them forward. The words, "keep moving," repeated like a heartbeat. One passenger, a businessman from Zurich, wrote that he had frozen in his seat and felt someone pull him upward by the collar. He never saw her face. He only heard her voice, steady, clear, impossible to ignore. He said that for years afterward, he could not board an aircraft without pausing at the rear door and looking at the flight attendant standing there. He was not looking for Harrison. He knew she was gone. He was looking for the kind of person she had been, someone who, in the worst moment of their life, would choose strangers over survival. He never found anyone who matched her. He suspected he never would. Alan Harrison, her father, rarely spoke about his daughter's death in public. He accepted the George Cross from the Queen at Buckingham Palace with the same quiet composure his colleagues on the Bradford police force had always known him for. When a reporter asked him whether he was proud, he paused for several seconds. Then he said, "She was always like that, even as a girl. If someone was in trouble, she went toward them, never away." He folded the metal case shut and walked out of the room without another word. The fire handle on the flight engineer's panel of a Boeing 707 is a T-shaped pull, painted red, mounted behind a guard to prevent accidental activation. When pulled, it closes the fuel valve, the hydraulic valve, and arms the extinguisher. It takes less than 2 seconds to pull. On April the 8th, 1968, that handle sat in its normal position for the entire flight, from the moment the engine exploded to the moment the cabin burned. If anyone had pulled it, the fuel would have stopped. The extinguisher would have worked, the fire might have gone out, and Barbara Jane Harrison might have walked off that airplane with everyone else. Her colleagues later described her in 3 words. "Come on, keep moving. It's only a short drop." Now, if this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, there is one right here that you need to see next, where another crew faced a fire they could not see, and the decision they made in the first 60 seconds was the only thing standing between 140 people and the ground.